Shalom and welcome to the History of Judaism, the history and story of the Jews, told by me, Yossi Silverman, a licensed tour guide and Jewish educator. The following podcast is made due to kind donations through ko-fi.com/scoutisrael or patreon.com/scoutisrael. You can also PayPal me if I don't have a sponsor for the next podcast, then it won't happen. So please feel free to visit ko-fi.com/scoutisrael or patreon.com/scoutisrael. You can also find the links on my Facebook page or my website scoutisrael.com. Without further ado, we're going to be discussing today the fall of the House of David, the beginning of a series of podcasts about the fall of the House of David. This podcast is entitled The Prophecy. Last time, we discussed the concept of the Am Haaretz, or the people of the land. We discussed the global political situation. We discussed specifically how a group of people, a kind of maybe landed gentry, landowning class in Israel, had a role in choosing the king somehow, and they installed a king. This king name was Jehoahaz, and this king was removed by the Egyptians and taken to Riblah. There he died in chains. He was then replaced by a gentleman known as Eliakim or Jehoiakim, but we're actually referring to him as Eliakim because his name was changed. In this podcast, we'll be specifically discussing what is a prophet, what is prophecy, how Jeremiah, or Yirmiyahu as we want to call him in Hebrew, the prophet, not the bullfrog, that's the last Jeremiah the bullfrog joke. So how Yirmiyahu differs from Yeshayahu, or Isaiah as people call him, and what is Yirmiyahu's role in the story. So I probably will say a few times again that Yirmiyahu is Jeremiah and Yeshayahu is Isaiah or Isaiah. Again, that could be a whole different person's podcast on how you pronounce that one. All the culture, and maybe somebody will correct me and say somehow there is some culture that isn't, but as far as I'm aware, all the cultures in the ancient Near East and beyond have something like a prophet. They have like a soothsayer or a prophet. The Greeks have oracles. The Romans were famous for slaughtering birds before battles and checking their entrails for mystical signs. In the Western culture, there's also kind of a myth of like a witch or a wise woman, and she makes curses about the future. We're all familiar with Shakespeare and the whole concept of beware of the Ides of March. If you're not familiar with Shakespeare and don't know what the concept of beware of the Ides of March is, email me. I can suggest many places where you can increase your education on that, but that's not so much what we're talking about. But yeah, you get the general idea. Everybody has a prophet. Some bloke that has a connection with the divine and predicts the future. However, there is certain thing which is, I don't want to say unique. The reason I don't want to say unique is I don't know that much about other cultures' prophets, but maybe out of the ordinary from what would have thought a prophet is. The prophet in Judea maybe does slightly different things, which we're going to discuss. We have a tendency in the modern world to compartmentalize things. We would say a prophet is like a spiritual advisor, and a royal counsellor, that's a temporal advisor. And these two things are different, right? You know, if let's say, I think this might have even happened. Let's say that a president started taking the advice of one of those people with a mumbo jumbo mystical astrology column, we would probably compartmentalise it. We'd probably say that's different from the President of the United States having a discussion with somebody who has a degree in politics and is, I don't know, maybe a military professional at West Point. We'd say that's different. I'm not sure that that's actually true for Judea, and I'm not sure it's true even for the ancient world either. Very much this compartmentalisation is an outgrowth of the modern world. A world that separates everything into nice, neat categories. In fact, the vast majority of modern science is based on separating things into nice, neat categories. You know, I have a degree in politics and philosophy, and my friend, he has a degree in biology. Therefore, I am a political scientist. I am a humanities major, and he is a science major. In the ancient world, things kind of flow a bit. The classic example with that discussion is a long time ago. Both of these would have just been called philosophy. One natural philosophy and one moral philosophy. So there's no neat categories. It's things are more of a bit of a continuum. In a literal sense, a prophet is both a mystical, supernatural analyst that predicts the unseen future, and he is also a political analyst who comments on what's actually going on around him. We think of all the prophecies being about, you know, the prophet going into a crazed trance and seeing the future, and sometimes they're not seeing the future, they're seeing what's going on. And also kind of cutting edge, and not just commentary, but also like political theatre. A good example I'm trying to give you, explain what I mean by political theatre. Good example of political theatre, Martin Luther King's march on the march to Washington, also his march to Selma. That would be political theatre. That I'm not talking about what's genuine and not genuine. I'm talking about how you make political change. So this is also what prophets do. So I'll give you an example which is relevant to our story. When Isaiah, Yeshayahu, as we mentioned a few podcasts ago, the Assyrians invade the country around about in the 8th century, and this is a historic event. And in the text in the Bible, it discusses Isaiah standing on the walls of Jerusalem all night in a prophetic rapture, calling out to God to get rid of the Assyrians. And this is prophecy, but it's also political theatre, right? And it's also a battle tactic, right? So you got all these things jammed together. We have to take them apart. When Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu and Isaiah and Jeremiah explain their political opinion that it's better to rely on the Babylonian Empire than the Egyptians, this is both prophecy and this is also global political analysis. An example of Jeremiah and political theatre, there's this scene where he takes his belt off in front of a great crowd of people, we'll call them the members of the press, and he buries his belt on a riverbank to show that he, even though Judah is going into exile, they will return before his belt decomposes. Now, sometimes journalists do predict the future. To a certain extent, by the way, maybe we could call the prophets the journalists of the day. There aren't any journalists. I mean, there are people who record things, but there's nobody to act as that kind of bulwark against the power of the king. You've got, in Judah, the position of the king. You've got the position of the priest, which is very much at least outwardly a ritual function. I'm sure they have political ones too. And you have the prophet, and I'd say the prophet is to a certain extent a journalist. Maybe prophets also just look at what's happening and then they give a description, they give an explanation over what they think the dangers are and what might happen. And then we say when it does, oh, that's prophecy. When the prophet advises the king not to support the Egyptians, because both Isaiah and Jeremiah call out against supporting the Egyptians and instead falling to the yoke of the Babylonians, that's from the point of view of global politics, not just spirituality. Now, we said the prophet is also a conscience of the body politic. He's very much the voice of, and she, by the way, I keep saying he, but if we're talking about generic prophets, we have female prophets. If you were listening to the podcast before last, you might have heard me mention the name of the prophet Huldah. She's prophetess. So they're also the conscience of the body politic, the voice of the poor, the downtrodden. Sometimes it's also the voice of common sense. You know, common sense would say don't treat people nastily. So Isaiah and Jeremiah, Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, are known for being the source in our world of religious social activism. They call for justice for the widow and the orphan and the stranger, and they really rail against some kind of social dynamic that seems to, an economic dynamic that seems to be going on in ancient Judah against the widow and the orphan and the stranger. And they explain that this is one of the reasons that the society is going to be destroyed. This is one of the reasons the temple is going to be burnt down. A city which is not just cannot continue to exist. Both Jeremiah and Isaiah are to a certain extent historical characters. We've always been wrestling, I feel, in the podcast with this challenge that maybe what I'm saying is more of a religious story. It's not really a historical story. Not really when you get to this point in history. A way I like to think of the struggle we've had in the podcast is we kind of look back into the mists of time, and as we get closer and closer to our point in time, these mists tend to clear. So we were looking right all the way back before we even rebooted the podcast over with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We're dealing with dense fog. Very difficult to see what became before a certain point in the history of this group we're calling the Jews. At this point in history, we're dealing with unclear history. We kind of know there's something over there. There's a mist in between us. We can't quite see it, but we can make out some shapes and hear some voices to know who's talking. So Isaiah, as we mentioned in, I think not last podcast, but the podcast before, is a historical character, or at least most people would say it is, mainly because we found his stamp, the stamp in the old city of Jerusalem, in the place in between the city of David and the Temple Mount, which said on it Isaiah prophet, Yeshayahu Navi. Many historians tend to think Jeremiah is also a historical character as well. So both of the books mention verifiable historical accounts with another account, a mirror account to it. The conquest of Sargon II and Sennacherib, which we've already covered. The downfall of the Assyrian Empire, which is, is hard to ignore that one. The Battle of Carchemish, which is something that happened, mentioned in name. The invasion of Judah by the Babylonians. That's just to name a few. So these are historical texts, but also we have the mist of history separating us, and also there, as we mentioned before, religious texts. So it's not going to be approached like a history textbook. Jeremiah seems intimately involved in the politics of his time. Not only this, there's a whole glut of what's called epigraphic finds, which means finds in archaeology to do with names from the Book of Jeremiah. in the city of David, just a few examples of this, they found 2 of the scribes that recorded Jeremiah's words, meaning they found the stamps of those scribes. What do we mean by stamp? Well, put very simply, you write a letter in the ancient world, you need to seal it, so you roll it up and you stamp onto the paper some clay, and you personalise it. So the stamp has your official signature, and it'll both have maybe a name and a little picture. So the names found, sometimes not a picture, at least the name. So the names found in the city of David archaeological park are Gedaliahu ben Pashhur and Yehuchal, or Jehukal in King James, ben Shlemiyahu. So Gedaliahu the son of Pashhur and Jehukal, or Yehukal ben Shlemiyah. And these are people who take a fairly significant role in the story of Jeremiah. Jeremiah also mentions a Babylonian eunuch, one of the servitors of the emperor of Babylon, who seemingly had a role in the story, which is called in the Bible. Now let me get this right, it's a little bit difficult because it is not the most easiest name to pronounce. Nebo Sarsekim. It is, yes, I know, it's a bit of a tongue twister, but don't worry. That's probably not the original Babylonian name, because there's a Babylonian source that talks about a eunuch called Nabu Sharu Usu Ukin. A lot easier than Nebo Sarsakim. So I don't focus on it so much. What we're talking about is that there's a name which sounds very similar, especially if you know the languages involved. It's probably the same person mentioned both in the biblical text and in the Babylonian source. In the next podcast, we're going to explore the destruction of Jerusalem, which Jeremiah and other biblical texts described. Even this is mirrored in Babylonian sources. So, but just by that alone, mentioned in the Bible, also mentioned in the Babylonian sources. The first question is, why does Jeremiah even bother? Like, why bother? You've got Yeshayahu. I keep saying all the way along, Isaiah, Yeshayahu and Jeremiah, they say the same things. So why have Jeremiah? Isaiah kind of predicts the destruction of the temple, predicts the exile, predicts the return of the captives. Why bother? What's even the difference between the two approaches? Firstly, Yeshayahu's approach, while wonderful, it hardly works, does it? There's a classic charge on the prophecy. If there's that so wonderful, why do people ignore it and then nasty things happen? Like, they predict the destruction of the temple, then people sin, then the temple's destroyed. Like, why bother prophesying in the first place? Temple was going to be destroyed. People aren't even going to listen to you. So that's another question. I feel when I read Yeshayahu, Isaiah, is kind of aloof. Maybe that's half the problem, really. He's aloof. Is like prophesying from the top of the mountain. He deals with all these lofty concepts like the moral, ethical mission of the Israelite people, being a light unto the nations. He sees like this utopian state of ultimate peace, where nation will not lift up sword against nation. Each man will beat his sword into plowshares and his spears into pruning hooks. By the way, I'm quoting there. Like, didn't make that one up myself. A vision of divine angels. And who is Isaiah? We see from the historical evidence, it's actually the official titled court prophet. Jeremiah, okay, he's not lowly. He's by no means lowly. He's the opposite of lowly. But he certainly becomes persona non grata. By the way, you can have really, really, really lowly prophets. There's one prophet, Amos, I believe, who is a fig orchard attendant. Not the most high job in the land. Also, we're going to discuss how he actually does get thrown into a pit or jail a few times. So I feel one of the big differences here between Jeremiah and Isaiah is that Jeremiah, you feel, is really prophesying from a pit. For example, Jeremiah predicts the destruction of Jerusalem, but he really goes into details. He says, Ko Amar Hashem, thus says God, Kutu Eitzah, cut down trees and spill out over Jerusalem a ramp. The city is to be incarcerated, is the best word of describing it in Hebrew. The city is to be incarcerated. All of it, everywhere there is oppression, that will be incarcerated. So that's just one example. He's talking about the physicality of actually having a siege. He's a physical, the down-to-earth guy. He talks about the pain of conquest with the phrase, the very, very memorable phrase, Me'ai ohila. Now, Me'ai means my bowels. My bowels, I cry in agony. That's typical Jeremiah, not this hoity-toity heavenly Isaiah. I'd like to focus in depth on one particular parable stroke vision, because it really, to me, it says what is Jeremiah. So this is from Jeremiah 24. God showed me 2 baskets of figs that were set before the temple of God. Meaning, a guy comes and he brings these figs to be presented at the temple, and after that, Nebuchadrezzar, that actually means Nebuchadnezzar. For some reason, they alternate between these two spellings. Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon had carried away the captive Jechoniah. We'll discuss that in a bit, what's happening there. And the son of Jehoiakim, and the princes of Judah with the craftsmen and the smiths from the temple, and brought them to Babylon. So this is the king of Babylon coming to take people captive and conquer the city. But we're still focusing on what's going on back in the temple, even though these people have been taken away captive. So one basket of figs was very good figs, and the other basket had very bad figs, which couldn't be eaten. They were so bad. And the Lord and God said to me, what do you see, Yirmiyahu? And I said, figs. And I said, some of the figs are very good, and some of the really bad ones look really bad, and you can't eat them because they're so bad. And God said to me, thus says God, the God of Israel, like these good figs, I will remember the exile of Judah, which I've taken from this place to the land of the Chaldeans, and I'll remember it for good, and I will place my eyes on them, and I will return them to this land. I'm going to skip a bit, and the bagged figs, which you can't eat because of badness, because God says, these bad figs I have given as Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and his princes, and the rest of Judea which are left in the land, and the people that live in Egypt. So that's the good figs, and that is the people who are going to be carried off into Babylon and brought back, and the bad figs is the king and all of his supporters. So what do we mean by bad figs? Well, I'll tell you, we don't mean unripe figs or slightly smelly figs either. We mean a very, very specific thing. So what's a bad fig? We're not talking, by the way, you can come to Israel in about May, and you'll start to see the young figs, and you can't eat them because they're a bit green. That's not what we mean either. So fig season is about August, September. A fig, you have to understand, to make a fig inedible, you have to understand how the fig tree is pollinated and what a fig is. A fig is not a fruit. It is actually an enclosed flower. Figs pollinate through a specific kind of wasp that lays its eggs on the fig flower, which is the fig itself, and then the maggots burrow through the fig. They eat the nectary, juicy bits, and they get covered in pollen. And then when they emerge as an adult wasp, they're covered in pollen, and they do the same thing. In that way, they pollinate fig trees. Many religious Jews know that you can't eat insects, so you have to thoroughly check figs. Very, very thoroughly. Some religious Jews don't even want to eat figs because of this. You have a lot of figs can be quite maggoty, and you can get a fig without a maggot. So what is a bad basket of figs is a basket of figs so ridden with these maggots, which are actually there to pollinate it, that it can't be eaten due to the laws of keeping kosher. And why would you want to anyway? It looks nasty. However, even a basket of bagged figs has a purpose. You can leave it in the orchard and they'll pollinate the fruit trees. Even bad Zedekiah has a purpose. So this is a very dense parable, a very dense vision, where you have really this evil, but even at the end of the day, the evil has a purpose, and the evil is a concept that really Jeremiah and Isaiah focus on. The even evil being an evil thing being a utensil used by God. Jeremiah is big into these set pieces of political theatre as well. He's always burying his belt in a stream in front of a vast group of people, like I mentioned before. He also buries a bottle as well, that kind of thing. The ultimate expression of Jeremiah is what I call pit prophecy in the book of Jeremiah, is the prophecy in Jeremiah 19 that as punishment, God will make the people eat the flesh of their own children. And this is echoed in the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, which is supposed to have also been written by Jeremiah, but I'm not going to get into who wrote what. That's too much like historicity. Also, really important to express, it's not all doom. Don't want to give the impression that Jeremiah is just doom. Just as he says in Jeremiah 33, once again will be heard the voice of joy and the voice of happiness, the voice of the bridegroom and the bride. This specific phrase in Hebrew, it's Od Yishama Ba'ari Yehuda, Kol Sason v'Kol Simcha, Kol Chatam v'Kol Kala. Once again will be heard in the cities of Judea. The voice of the bridegroom and the bride is actually mentioned as sang very joyfully at every wedding. Also, Jeremiah has a concept of too much anger. And part of the reason that the destruction is supposed to stop and the exile is supposed to be stopped and people have returned is because this concept of too much anger, that it's almost as if Jeremiah describes it as God having a cup filled with anger which spills over and then can't be filled anymore. There can't be any more angry actions anymore. In short, we have Jeremiah who starts off in Josiah's reign, following on from Hulda's prophecy, and that the end is coming. He starts what is never a great idea for somebody who wants to have a quiet life, preaching the destruction of Judah brought by the king. He preaches against the Egyptians and that they would receive the iron yoke of the king of Babylon, meaning the Egyptians and the Judeans. And he wanders the country prophesying against false prophets, telling people that evils are coming, making people fairly angry with him. So now let's plug this back into the story. Yeah, as we described last time, Josiah previously dies in battle and then is succeeded by his son Jehoahaz, who's supported by the people of the land. And here's a little bit of a thing I was saving for near the end. Jehoahaz has a very important father-in-law. Who do you think? Yes, you guessed it. His father-in-law is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the king's father-in-law. So that's how closely inside the court he is. Jehoahaz marries a lady by the name of Hamutal, which literally means heat and dew. I don't know why. Maybe I'll try and work out later. And all is not well. the Egyptians have been very much involved in the story and the death of Josiah. They invade and they depose Jeremiah's son-in-law, as we said last time, and they replace him with Jehoahaz's brother, Eliakim, and they change his name to Jehoiakim or Jehoiakim. And he reigns for 8 years, and Jeremiah is pretty darn unhappy with him. And you can understand that Jeremiah is probably not the flavour of the month either. He is against the support by Eliakim for Egypt and his idolatrous practice and the continuation of all this oppression of the widow and the weak. And then at some point he stops support for Egypt. Eliakim stops supporting Egypt and recognises that he does have to support the Babylonians, but he only does this for a very short time. Then he rebels again and carries on supporting for Egypt, probably hedging his bets. The Book of Kings describes him filling Jerusalem with innocent blood, which doesn't go unnoticed by Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu explains that really it's this which is going to bring down the destruction of Judah. It was a tumultuous time with the deposing of kings and intrigue from Egypt, as discussed in the Evil King podcast, and it's fairly safe to assume that people are getting whacked left and right and centre by Eliakim, and the populace is suffering. Then Eliakim manages to get through it, dying by natural causes, and his son, get this, his name was Jehoiakim, or Jehoiakim, Kim. His son is Jehoiakim with an N at the end, just to make things doubly more confusing. So Jehoiakim or Jehoiakim takes over, and he carries on. We'll call him Konya, because that's one of his nicknames. So Konya takes over, and he carries on the revolt against the Babylonians and support for the Egyptians, all of which Jeremiah disapproves of, because of course his son-in-law was the guy who is against the Egyptians. So there's also that there as well. Now the Babylonians, they eventually invade, and they take Jehoiakim away and put in Zedekiah, who's an uncle of Jehoiakim, just to make things even more confusing. Jehoahaz, who then was taken away to Riblah, and then Eliakim takes over, and then he dies, and then his son Jehoiakim becomes king. Then he's taken away, and another of his father's brothers takes over again, Zedekiah. So really, you've got 3 brothers here, haven't you? You've got Eliakim, Jehoahaz, and Zedekiah. So Zedekiah, the third of the brothers, he becomes king, and he's not much better. Yirmiyahu also makes prophecies against him, saying basically that Yehuda was supporting the wrong side, the Egyptians, and he's suspected of treachery. If you're going to go attacking Egyptians and the king is supporting Egyptians, people might call that treachery. So a group of courtiers come along and throw Yirmiyahu for not the last time in a pit. Many think a cistern. There's kind of the cisterns collect water, big holes in the ground that collect water, and they also teach them to collect a lot of mud in the bottom of the cisterns, and he gets stuck in the mud there. And he also calls out and makes prophecies, whilst there are 2 people we mentioned today, Gedaliahu ben Pashhur and Yehukal ben Shlemiah. They record it. So they sit there and they record the words of Jeremiah, and they record him saying, thus says God, who sits in this city will die by the sword and by hunger and by pestilence, and anybody who goes out to the Chaldeans, meaning to the Babylonians, they will survive. And he says, thus says God, he who sits in this city, he will die. He who runs away from the city, runs towards the Babylonians, runs towards the Chaldeans, he says, will survive and shall live. And you can't say it clearer than that. Something which you might have thought was very strange in the last episode was me sitting with my son as we made this cardboard diorama of ancient Israel, and you're probably thinking, why are we doing these arts and crafts? Well, what we were creating there was really the reality of this situation. It's not just about an evil king committing idolatrous crimes and killing the widow and the poor. It's also about supporting the wrong geopolitical actor, supporting Babylon against Egypt. This is a rebellion. This is a rebellion against the correct imperial overlords. That is the big sin. You're rebelling against your elders and your betters. And we're going to see next time what happens when Judah rebels against its elders and its betters. Thank you very much for listening. You have been listening to the history and story of the Jews told by me, Yossi Silverman, tour guide and Jewish educator, except not right now because it's the corona crisis. This has all been recorded during the corona crisis. I do not have much work. I'm working in manual labour. I'm not complaining about that. I'm telling you because I do not have the money for the hosting for this podcast. So if you want to see the next podcast, that will rely on you helping in your support by going to ko-fi.com/scoutisrael and donating, or going to patreon.com/scoutisrael and also donating. You can also see the links for these two different ways of donating in the various descriptions and show notes on the SoundCloud and also on YouTube, because eventually I'm uploading this to YouTube. If you cannot afford donation, I understand. It is the corona crisis. I cannot make another podcast until you do this, but if you want to show another kind of support, go right this second to the Scout Israel YouTube channel. Type in to YouTube Scout Israel. That will direct you directly to the Scout Israel YouTube channel, and subscribe. Another way of me supporting myself is through monetization. I need 1,000 YouTube subscribers to even think about monetizing, and a similar number on SoundCloud. So also click subscribe right now. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully the next podcast will be out very soon on the discussion of the destruction of Judah.